welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Maria Schepers. That was a faint attempt of the introduction to I'd Love to Change the World. And I think many of us looking around these days might wish that we could change the world. And if there's one thing that our protagonist, whom we met as Hans Burgner, has experienced in his attempt to self-realize, it is that, first of all, that he can't get it for free. He can't steal his attainment. And in order to make any meaningful changes in the world around him, he'll have to first be able to change himself. And I was just thinking about in the beginning of the book, in the preface, when we meet the mysterious Adam Kadmon, right? Because we can look at the development of Hans Burgner's soul and see that he really finds himself in quite the challenging circumstances. However, we've already met his future masterful self. So, without meaning to give it away, we know he'll make it. And so, think about that for yourself. Imagine that somewhere in the future awaits that version of yourself who has overcome, transcended all the obstacles, all the challenges, all the entrapments of this often strange existence. So, without further ado, let's go and meet the next incarnation. And we remember from the end of the previous chapter, chapter 12, that he has just been born in Milan on Christmas Day, the year 1616. Chapter 13, The Sun and the Moon. My new name was Giuseppe Francesco Bori, after my father, who was advanced in years when I was born. The name Bori, translated as Burhus, was to play an infamous role in the history of alchemy. And yes, most of the epithets commonly hurled at it were founded on short-sighted and irritable incomprehension. Burhus was not by any means an unscrupulous con man who used every possible means to secure his end, a comfortable life. I was already far from desiring a comfortable life. The portion of my life observed by others was just the outline of a puzzle whose solution lay elsewhere. What could I have told my contemporaries about my goal? Whom could I have permitted to guess at my cataclysmic, haunted personal cosmos? And to what mortal could I have told the truth about my bizarre and tragic alliance with Homunculus? My father was a physician and amateur alchemist. He was a gentle being who shied away from the passionate arguments that were then raging about alchemy. Thus, he allowed himself to be satisfied with partial results. Nowadays, he would be an obscure professor in a small college. My mother was a fragile, oversensitive creature who was much younger than her husband. She was a poor, distant relation of his who had come to town to act as his housekeeper, and she had brought gentle cheer into his house. He came to love the charming, delicate girl dearly, but it would never have occurred to him to marry her. It was her idea from the beginning, and everyone thought it was merely a whim. They all tried to talk her out of tying herself to a man 25 years her senior. But my mother held out stubbornly, and she advanced arguments that embarrassed, touched, and astonished her intended. At first, he shrank back from raising so violent a storm so late in his life. He had already discounted the possibility of marriage and did not even want it. He liked tranquility and solitary contemplations. Why, we could search the whole world. my mother declared, without finding anyone else with whom we could converse in such peace and friendship. And you know I'm too weak to endure the passion of a young, virile man. And you are not young enough to find an understanding partner easily. Someone who would provide you with everything and not disturb your peace. Neither of us really likes being alone. We feel happiest when we're together, so why shouldn't you take me as your wife? Just because the world disapproves? Because it is unusual? Well, I thank God we are not usual people. It is only a matter of whether we dare to get on the right path in spite of everyone, whether we dare to be happy in our own way. It was my mother's fascinating originality, not the magic of her young body, that won the day. My parents frequently joked about the circumstances of their marriage, even in my presence, laughing at how the passive and submissive young woman had gotten her own way. The results of the marriage justified my mother's efforts. The two of them were true friends, infinitely tender without the need for passion. Each needed what the other had. My father admired my mother's mystic dreams and visions, which she related softly. He respected her as the possessor of these holy things. He drew her into his work, asked and accepted her advice, accommodated himself to her sensitive moods, and truly suffered with her during migraines and menstrual problems. As for her, all she asked was to play a leading role in his life and deserve his faith and admiration. Their personalities fit together like the two pieces of a broken dish. Alone, each was strange and difficult to understand. Together, they formed a whole. This setting was particularly appropriate for me. At last, I was in an environment as unusual as my own personal makeup. I felt like an animal hiding behind a successful camouflage. I didn't have to conceal my anguish and constant awareness of the other world. My father believed wholeheartedly in the presence of the other world, and my mother not only sensed but sometimes saw it. Her underdeveloped body and oversensitive nervous system that responded to the slightest influence placed only the thinnest of veils over her third eye, which was open and observant of the spiritual kingdom. Even now, I am overcome with emotion when I think of those two. How much they loved me. It was a tireless, unbounded love. How often they kept vigil by my bed when I was an infant, silently holding hands and watching me while my soul wandered in the astral labyrinth. Whenever I awoke from these wanderings, I always saw their gentle eyes. My mother sensed what my problem was and always knew what to do. She was the first woman who showed me the most profound mystery of that other sex. In her, I saw through the petty, superficial existence of the human female the image of the mighty and tender mother. When I was with her, I sensed for the first time that the solution for all ills may be found in the protecting and healing feminine being. My mother was the only person who could drive away my tormentors. She would pass her narrow, long-fingered hands over me 3 or 4 times. I can still see her tense, introspective expression as she worked, with her curved eyelids draping those sparkling, caressing eyes. Slowly, she would repeat the motions over my convulsed body, never quite touching it. I could see a space between her hand and my flesh, but still I felt her balmy touch. Then the convulsions would cease and the astral world leave me. I could breathe clean air again without the putrid scent of decay. Then I would relax and sleep. I had a recurring vision that would slide me into a gentle, dreamless sleep. It seemed I was lying on my back in a boat, eyes half closed, looking out at the quiet, translucent water on which I was floating. Someone wearing a long, cowled cloak stood in the prow with his back toward me, rowing slowly and soundlessly. We were in a world of calm water, translucent air, and clear sky, traveling together through endless space to an unknown destination, gradually to become absorbed in peaceful light. My mother had boundless spiritual ingenuity where I was concerned. She besieged her inner world with a persistent clamor until she broke through the gate of secrets. Without ever having heard of them in her current life, she uncovered profound mysteries unaided and learned procedures that were sealed in occult tradition. She managed to find real solutions by this inward listening. When she saw how I was being persecuted and realized that her magic lines only helped me for a short time, she searched with a delicate instrument that was her soul and brought from the Akasha the secret of the protective cloak. Every night, she would wrap me in this invisible protective cloak of concentration. "Now I am going to cover you," she would say gently as she stood by the bed. Then a wonderful and incomprehensible drama would be played out. I would feel something like a soft, fine linen winding around my body 12 times long ways and 12 times sideways. It was a restful feeling, and I knew I was in an impenetrable cover through which the angry astral claws could not pass. This covering poured from my mother's soul and eyes. It was stronger than any sin or passion because it was woven of the will of unconquerable love. My mother always wore blue. Her long velvet dresses had high collars and high waists, and there were often light blue stripes among the dark blue pleats. She usually had her tiny blonde curls caught up in a blue silk net. She always wore an old-fashioned silver brooch and matching ring. They were worked with the figure of a triangle standing on its apex, in which a slim, flat-chested female figure trod on a serpent's head. These pieces had been left to her by an aunt who had been a nun. I was fascinated by the Gothic silver virgin in the blue enameled dress and the serpent she trampled, but my mother wouldn't tell me what they meant. She got upset when I asked. It was some time later that I learned why. I did not try to hide most things about myself from my parents, but I could not bring myself to tell them that I remembered my previous lives and names. I didn't conceal the fact that I was mentally mature beyond my chronological age or the dark connection I had with the other world. But I was terrified that they would reject me in horror if they learned my crime. For the paralyzing awareness of my true identity didn't leave me for a second. I knew the body was only a disguise and I in it was Hans Burgner, the murderer fleeing the consequences of his crime. The average human being who slowly drifts between the barriers of time and space cannot understand the mercy of that lack of memory. The tabula rasa, that is the gift of every new birth. No one could bear the full truth all at once. Even today, doctors have to work long and carefully to bring to the surface and deal with the subconscious hurts and petty crimes of a single lifetime. Even these emotional pebbles prove to be great obstacles, causing considerable trouble to the nervous system. So how could one vulnerable human being balancing on the high wire of a single life bear the burdens of a long series of lives? Once, when I was about 11, I overheard my parents talking about me. They were sitting in their little backyard, which was singularly peaceful, with its black and white flagstones. My mother was sitting in her straight-backed chair under a cypress tree, embroidering flowers on a piece of silk. My father was resting his aching feet on a small footstool. I am sure he must have had rheumatism, and he was sorting colors for her. He was a tall, strong man with childlike blue eyes who radiated the gentleness of the big man and his characteristic awkward willingness to help others. I had been suffering from a slight fever that day, so I went to sleep after lunch. My mother, with her usual excellent instinct, had made me a slightly sour drink to arrest the fever, lemon juice with honey and water. When I woke from my subsequent rest, I was alone in my room. I got up and went toward the backyard where my parents always sat that time of day. I was just in the act of pulling back the door curtain when I heard my father's voice. "Francesco?" He sounded perturbed. "Yes," my mother replied. "He is burdened by some great sin." "If I only knew where you get these ideas, Marietta." "I can feel them." "But this time you are mistaken, my little one. Francesco wouldn't hurt a fly. You know how he begged old Lena not to kill that chicken?" "That just proves my point. Most children are cruel and bloodthirsty because they have drunk the water of forgetfulness at birth and don't know what the blood and screams really mean. But Francesco knows, he remembers, but he doesn't dare talk about it. If you could just see his invisible surroundings and his fears, they're far more serious than any childish scares." "But what is it he is afraid of? What does he remember?" "The day he realizes nothing in the world could ever make us reject him, he will tell us." My mother answered calmly. "But if you really think he is burdened with a torment like that, why don't you encourage him to tell us about it?" "For the same reason. I don't stand in front of a tree in the spring and urge its buds to ripen promptly. Francesco's trust is not yet ripe because he is too lonely, introverted, and frightened. It's usually that way with persecuted people." "Oh, Marietta, you confuse and disturb me so greatly," my father burst out. "I'm sorry, Giuseppe, but what else could I do? I can't keep carrying this burden of concern all by myself." "You are an alarmist, Marietta, dear. Who would ever persecute our timid little Francesco? Why, he hardly ever even leaves the garden. He's growing up right in front of us." "Francesco's crime is old. He didn't commit it in this body." "Oh, so that's what you mean." "Yes." "But Lord God, if we accept that idea, we would have to look for a murderer behind the innocent face of every child." I watched through the curtain as my mother leaned forward and covered my father's hand with her own, her brow wrinkled with earnestness. "Listen, and try to understand. Francesco has suffered more than anyone else I've ever heard of because he has carried over his memory into his new body. He is like a man with his eyelids cut off, forced to stare forever. He is not blessed by the restful blindness of death's dream or the unawareness normal to birth and childhood. If only you knew how he is perpetually tormented to the bounds of human endurance, and I can't help him. Sometimes I feel so helpless, I'd like to die and forget the whole thing." Her voice broke, and she put her face in her hands and sobbed. My father reached out and lifted her into his lap as though she were a child. Their features grew indistinct as the silvery twilight settled on the garden. I heard my father's consoling murmur in the dusk. "Calm down, dear. Don't torture yourself so. You know you could never try to escape sinfully from suffering and responsibility. We are all being burned through and through by the pure fire of love. Don't we have more faith in Francesco than we have in ourselves? Who would understand him and protect and encourage him if we evaded our responsibility? We shall live as long as God allows and stand by him. If he is guilty, we will beleaguer heaven for his forgiveness. If he is weary, we will make him a bed of our tenderness. If he is frightened, our bodies and souls will be the barriers to protect him. My darling Giuseppe, I heard my mother's tearful voice through the dark garden. I'm so weak and feeble as the moon up there. What would I do without your life-giving son? That is the way it should be, Marietta. The sun and the moon are indeed a mystic couple, and no two beings can come into true union unless one soul has the attributes of the one and the other soul those of the other. Then they radiate toward each other and provide love and light. My mother stood up in the shimmering light of the half moon and wiped her eyes. Francesco's sleeping a long time today. It's because of the fever. When she came in with her candle to check on me, I was lying on my back with my eyes closed. I could hear her dress rustle as she leaned over me and her fingers caressed my face. He's been crying, she whispered over her shoulder. It was in his sleep, my dear. Why did I pretend I was asleep? Why hadn't I run into the garden and knelt before them, beating my breast? Did I not trust them? More than I trusted myself. Did I fear to lose their love? No, I knew it to be boundless and unconditional. Why did I pretend to be asleep and reject such living, healing love? My whole inner being was in burning upheaval to rush out and confess to them. All my horrible memories expanded within me in my desire to pour them out, but I knew I had to remain silent. I was paralyzed by a feeling completely new to me, compassion. If I had been selfish, I would have been eager to seek relief by transferring my heavy burden. But for the first time in my memory, I was restrained by a tender desire, the desire to be considerate of someone else. It had been fear and shame that had kept me from confessing to Amadeus Bar, but now I wanted to remain silent so the burden would be mine and mine alone. No matter how much my parents were worried about me, the situation would be easier for them to bear if they didn't know my past and its terrible consequences. The desire to tell them fought inside me for days and weeks. My mother, who seemed to feel my conflict and realize that her own time was short, broke down and tearfully urged me to unburden myself. When I was away from her, the memory of her pleas would break my resistance and I would run to tell her everything. But as soon as I would see her, her physical condition would restrain me. For she was pregnant again and she got terribly thin. She couldn't keep down any food and her back hurt. As the pregnancy progressed, she grew so weak she could hardly walk, and finally she had to take to her bed. My father was nearly prostrate with worry. Then one night the event we had dreaded happened. She began to deliver prematurely with massive hemorrhaging. She must have been in excruciating pain, for she kept breaking into inarticulate screams, intensifying and diminishing like a blood-curdling aria by mad composer. The heart-rending cries filled the whole house with alarm and despair. I can still remember my emotional chaos as I stumbled through the darkened rooms where scared women whispered softly together amid an odor of sickness. Suddenly, I was a homeless stranger, panic-stricken in my sense of total loss. I ran to distant rooms to get away from those horrible screams. My teeth chattered as I moaned, shouted, prayed, and cursed. But the screaming didn't stop. It lacerated our bodies and souls for 2 whole days and nights. I remember watching Madalena, the midwife, help my father out of the sick room on that second day. She had to lead him like a child. He was crying. "You won't let her die, will you, Madalena? For God's sake, don't let my little girl bleed to death." There was blood on his shirt, and he tottered like a drunken man. Madalena helped him to a chair. "Just leave it to us, Signor Bori. We're doing everything that can be done for her. You can't do anything else. You'll collapse from fatigue." No, I must go back. I must help," the poor man said mechanically. Then his eyelids drooped and he slept the sleep of exhaustion for a few minutes. He came to with a start, jumped up and went back into the sick room. My own physical suffering, all the fear, shame, and guilt I had ever felt paled into insignificance in my compassion for my parents. There was a deathly quiet the third day. My mother's strength was spent. Her voice began to break and fade. Then suddenly, there was total silence. More horrible than those ravaging screams. Life itself froze in the disheveled rooms caught between sunset and death. The women were working in grim silence, muted by their awareness they had lost the struggle. Then I heard a soft, shuffling motion, and my father came and took my hand. He seemed suddenly old and stooped, and his hand was icy cold as he led me into their bedroom. My mother lay stretched out on the ravaged bed. All around it were overturned chairs, blood-stained bandages, tubs of horrible contents, and pools of blood. The room was filled with a nauseating odor, yet the waxen, bloodless figure on the bed was majestic and commanded respect. We came closer. I was surprised to see a joyous expression on the wasted face. It was as though behind her closed eyes she listened to some hopeful sound from the ethereal distance. The silver ring with the Gothic Virgin treading on the serpent's head shone dully on her smooth hand. As I stared at it, it seemed to hear her voice. "Do you understand it now? The message of Sister Beatrice, the nun, was that the initiate must crush the head of the serpent. I should never have embraced and given birth. Hers is a message to the fallen. The eternal priestess is never absolved from her vows. Today the priestesses of Isis are nuns. Oh, Isis, Isis." The sentences fell unexpectedly into my empty inner space, and I shuddered and leaned closer to read more from her lips. But now her cold mouth was an eternally closed gate, and her body a ruin the dweller had abandoned. And yet, my heart pounded wildly. There was a flash from under one of her eyelids. Her soul, receding to purer planes, looked back at me and waved goodbye. With an encouraging, almost cheerful smile. "Francesco, I am really alive. I always have been alive, and I shall live forever." This blessed promise thawed the icy horror within me and changed it into an incomprehensible hope, and only then was I finally able to weep the tears that would not come during the 3 days of darkness. Chapter 14, Reflected Light. The brief moment of spiritual communication passed, and then came all the rites of death. My father became a sick, weeping old man. His mind became confused. It could not accept my mother's death. With sinking heart, I would watch him get up from his seat under the cypress tree and wave to me with a sweet, gentle smile. "Bring me the key, Francesco boy. Your mother will be back from church soon." He would wait for me impatiently. "Hurry, son, mother can't get in." I would give him the key, and he would grab it eagerly, limp to the gate, open it, and wait. Sometimes he would look down the street with an intent smile, waiting for her to come. Then he would go out into the street. When my worry led me to follow him, he would smile encouragingly, but it was obvious his mind was already clearing. "She will turn the corner soon," he would say. And so the two of us would stand there, and he would lean on me as his troubled legs began to ache, and he began to feel hopeless. I never dared say anything, for these memory lapses always ended the same way. Suddenly, the smile would be replaced by an old man's tragedy. "Let's go inside," he would say softly. "My poor boy." Then he would let me help him back into his chair in the garden. A pedantic, religious old spinster named Maria Dora came to look after us. She was an aunt of my mother's, one of those women who always play second fiddle in life. She took care of the dying and nursed the newborn. Then after the little ones grew old enough to leave the nest, she would complain forever about how ungrateful they were when they refused to let her meddle in their private affairs. She was a good and self-sacrificing woman, but somehow she made the qualities irritating and became a burden to the people she smothered with her loving care. She had to have someone to pamper, someone she could urge to eat, drink, or rest when he didn't want to. To top it off, she had the unfortunate knack of being tactless without meaning to be or realizing it. I believe this trait really came from her secret need to suffer various indignities so she could cry over the results of her peremptory good deeds. Our family trouble came at an opportune time for this professional caretaker of family troubles. She took the delirious, helpless old man and the skinny, motherless boy under her wing, cooing and flitting about in her eagerness. I appreciated her, but she irritated me too, especially by the maladroit way she handled my father. For Maria Dora was as inflexible as iron. How could she understand my father's unbearable sorrow, which led him into realms of insane hope and grim despair? How could she sense the struggle in his hazy mind? She could feed, clothe, and bathe him and apply poultices and compresses, but when he wandered in the dimensions of time, she punctured his fancies patently. "Now, Giuseppe, you know perfectly well that Marietta is dead. She died in childbirth. She won't be coming home from church or anywhere else. Now, calm down. You know she's never coming back." She was always surprised when her reassurance put her gentle patient into a towering rage. "Get away from me, you shameless hussy! You won't let her see me. You're keeping her from getting in. She's out at the gate, cold and tired, and you have stolen all her belongings. Marietta, please help me, dearest!" My father didn't live but a year after my mother died. My new guardian was my father's half-brother, an old and overworked silk weaver who was glad to hand me over to Maria Dora. I saw him briefly at the funeral. He was a restless man with yellow-stained fingers and a preoccupied stare. He could hardly sit still through the reading of the will. The minute it was over, he jumped up and came over to us. Maria Dora, the triumphant queen of bereavement, was embracing my shoulders, holding me in front of her like a shield. She was in her element. Not even the black veil and tear-stained face could hide her elation. My guardian, on the other hand, looked at me as though I were some spoiled food he had to eat. "Well, that's that," he said sourly. "Giuseppe always was careless. When he was a kid, he'd exchange his piece of plum cake for a green frog. Then he had to marry at his age, and now there's this boy. Don't you go worrying your head about him. Just you provide what's coming to him, and I'll do the rest." Maria Dora's attack was so vehement that my guardian blinked. Well, of course, it doesn't really matter." So they left it at that. He paid his cash obligations every month and never darkened our door. Fortunately, Maria Dora liked our roomy old house, so we stayed there amid the beautiful, gloomy memories. We had no material worries. My parents had left a small estate that was rented to cover our modest expenses. I have never spent a more interesting and sheltered youth than that one in Milano, by the Catarana Canal, amid my tactful and tender ghosts. It was easy enough to handle Maria Dora. I quickly learned and catered to all her weaknesses so that she thought she controlled the house while actually dancing on my string. For the first time in her life, she was really happy. When I remember how much she thought of me, I can't help but be ashamed of my behavior. She believed, and I made her believe, that I was totally virtuous, composed in equal parts of kindness, gratitude, fear of God, and diligence. And she thought I was a superior intelligence as well, especially when Fra Niccolò started singing my praises. Fra Niccolò was one of the teaching monks from the monastery of San Marco. I had accepted him as a teacher so I would not be hounded to get an education. Of course, the narrow-minded little priest was astonished at how fast I learned to read, write, and do arithmetic. I only had to put up with him a couple of hours a day. The rest of the time I could really study, researching in books and performing experiments in my father's modest workshop. When I began my studies, my only asset was an avid and desperate diligence. I swiftly learned to my dismay just how ill-informed I was. I didn't know where to start or what paths to pursue. The essence of alchemy seemed like a tangled mass of thread that I could unravel by pulling the end. If only I could find the end. I knew a great deal about the outer manifestations of the science and its visible effects, of course. I had known and served the Magus, admired and finally killed him. I had drunk the stolen essence, and now I possessed seeing eyes and lived in two worlds simultaneously. I had performed a transmutation in a dilettante's workshop and summoned the initiate between the four green mirrors at Dry Cecilberg. I had consciously passed twice through the gates of life and death, but I still didn't understand any of these things. I had just used these mysterious, powerful forces as a layman uses electricity today, with some knowledge of their habits, but not of their inner rules and dangers. Thus the forces reacted differently from my expectations every time. They kept turning against me to crush me, acting on some unknown law that controlled them.